Ma'am, that seat isn't yours. Our VIP guest is already here. The words cracked through the quiet first-class cabin with the kind of certainty that made conversations stop mid-sentence. Every nearby passenger looked up as the senior flight attendant stretched out her arm, politely but firmly blocking the woman standing beside seat 2A. Across the aisle, a well-dressed white businessman adjusted his tailored jacket with a satisfied smile as another crew member carefully placed his leather briefcase into the overhead bin above the very seat printed on the boarding pass still resting in the woman's hand. No one asked to see her ticket. No one questioned his. In that single moment, appearance had already become evidence. Naomi Brooks didn't argue. At 44, she had learned that some rooms revealed more about themselves in silence than they ever would through conversation. Dressed in dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a fitted navy sweater, she looked like someone returning home from a long business trip, not someone whose signature could redirect hundreds of millions of dollars before lunch. There was no designer handbag hanging from her shoulder, no jewelry demanding attention, no assistant following behind. That was intentional. She had boarded dozens of flights exactly this way over the past decade, quietly observing how people behaved before they knew who she was. Sometimes the experience restored her faith in people. Other times, it reminded her why her work still mattered. The flight from Chicago to Seattle had not even pushed back from the gate. Outside the window, baggage carts rolled beneath a cloudy afternoon sky, while fuel trucks moved with practiced precision across the tarmac. Inside the aircraft, however, another kind of machinery had already started operating. Assumptions, bias, quiet calculations made in seconds. The senior flight attendant smiled politely, but her eyes never softened. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this passenger has elite platinum status. We need you to move to row 18 until we sort this out." Naomi glanced once at the businessman, now settling comfortably into seat 2A. He didn't look embarrassed. If anything, he seemed relieved that someone else had made the decision for him. He crossed one leg over the other and accepted a glass of sparkling water before the aircraft door had even closed. A woman seated across the aisle frowned as she looked from Naomi to the boarding pass still visible in her hand. A college student several rows back removed one earbud, sensing something wasn't right. A young flight attendant standing near the galley hesitated for half a second, studying the digital manifest on her tablet before lowering it again without saying a word. The cabin remained calm, but the air itself seemed heavier. Naomi slowly folded her boarding pass without taking her eyes off the crew member blocking her way. She had seen this expression before. At 26, inside a luxury hotel lobby where security insisted she couldn't possibly be a registered guest. At 33, during an investment conference where another executive asked whose assistant she was before introducing himself. Different cities, different uniforms. The same quiet verdict delivered before anyone cared about facts. She took one measured breath. "Would you mind checking the boarding pass one more time?" she asked gently. The flight attendant offered a rehearsed smile that never reached her eyes. "Ma'am, we've already handled the situation." Around them, conversations faded into whispers. Nobody could have guessed that within the hour, one phone call connected to a $940 million partnership would leave this entire cabin so silent that even the sound of the engines would seem louder than the words no one could take back. Naomi Brooks did not move. She simply stood beside the seat printed on her boarding pass, her carry-on resting quietly at her feet while the cabin waited for a reaction that never came. Years earlier, she might have defended herself immediately, listing credentials, demanding supervisors, insisting someone verify the reservation. Experience had taught her something far more valuable. The truth rarely needed volume. It only needed time. The businessman seated comfortably in 2A loosened his tie and glanced toward the flight attendant with a satisfied nod, almost as though the matter had already been settled. "Thank you," he said casually. "I knew there had been some kind of mistake." The senior flight attendant smiled warmly at him before turning back to Naomi with noticeably colder eyes. "Ma'am, we cannot delay boarding any longer." Naomi looked at the boarding pass one last time before carefully placing it inside the front pocket of her travel bag. Flight 482 had been only one stop on a much longer day. She had left New York before sunrise after finishing 12 straight hours of negotiations with international investors. Seattle was supposed to be the final destination before tomorrow morning's board meeting. Very few people outside a small executive circle knew that the meeting involved Meridian Capital's proposed $940 million strategic partnership with Horizon Air Group, an agreement expected to reshape the airline's premium travel experience for years to come. Naomi had insisted on traveling without corporate security, without luxury transportation, and without anyone announcing her arrival. She believed leadership meant understanding the customer experience exactly as customers lived it. If employees only acted professionally when executives were watching, then leadership had already failed. The aircraft smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished leather. Overhead bins clicked shut while passengers settled into their seats. Somewhere near the rear of the cabin, a child laughed before being gently reminded by his mother to use an indoor voice. Ordinary moments continued around an extraordinary injustice that most people had not fully recognized yet. A young flight attendant named Emily Carter remained near the galley entrance, holding her tablet a little tighter than before. She quietly reopened the passenger manifest, her eyes moving between the screen and Naomi's face. Something about the name looked familiar. She remembered scanning a boarding pass only minutes earlier that matched seat 2A perfectly. She looked toward the senior attendant, considering whether to speak, but years of learning airline hierarchy reminded her that questioning a supervisor in front of passengers rarely ended well. She lowered the tablet again, although uncertainty remained written across her face. Across the aisle, an older woman folded her newspaper and watched silently. A software engineer seated behind her removed his laptop from the tray table without opening it, sensing that whatever happened next deserved his full attention. No one reached for a camera. No one interrupted. The cabin seemed suspended between routine and something far more uncomfortable. Naomi finally spoke again, her voice calm enough that several passengers leaned closer just to hear it. "May I ask one question?" The senior attendant nodded impatiently. "Did anyone actually scan my boarding pass before deciding someone else belonged in my seat?" The question lingered in the cabin longer than anyone expected. It was simple, direct, impossible to dismiss without exposing whether procedure had actually been followed. Emily looked down at her tablet once more, then slowly raised her eyes. She knew the answer. She had scanned it herself, and it had turned green. Emily Carter swallowed quietly before taking a cautious step forward. Her voice was respectful, almost apologetic. "I remember scanning her boarding pass at the gate. It cleared for seat 2 Alpha." The words barely left her mouth before the senior flight attendant turned sharply toward her. "Emily, I did not ask for your opinion." The younger attendant immediately fell silent, but the statement had already settled over the cabin like a stone dropped into still water. Several passengers exchanged uncertain glances. If the boarding pass had scanned correctly, why was another passenger sitting in the seat? The senior attendant recovered quickly, forcing another professional smile. "Sometimes the system updates after boarding. These things happen." Naomi listened without interrupting. She had negotiated billion-dollar agreements across 3 continents. She recognized the difference between an honest mistake and an explanation created after the decision had already been made. The businessman resting comfortably in her seat leaned slightly into the aisle. "Look," he said with an impatient sigh, "I fly every week. Elite members get priority adjustments all the time. I am sure the airline knows what it is doing." Naomi turned toward him politely. "Did anyone tell you that the seat already belonged to someone else?" He hesitated for only a second before shrugging. "They told me they had a better arrangement available. I accepted it." His answer revealed more than he realized. No one had verified ownership. No one had asked permission. Someone had simply decided that moving one passenger would be easier than disappointing another. Near the front galley, the lead purser entered the cabin after hearing the raised voices. His name badge identified him as Daniel Reeves. Calm and experienced, he approached with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to resolving passenger disputes before departure. "Good afternoon," he said evenly. "I understand there is confusion regarding seating." The senior attendant immediately answered before Naomi could speak. "This passenger refuses to cooperate after we reassigned her seat." Daniel nodded without looking at Naomi's boarding pass. Instead, he directed his attention toward the businessman already seated in 2 Alpha. "Sir, are you comfortable where you are?" "Absolutely," the man replied with a relaxed smile. "Excellent service." Daniel smiled back before turning to Naomi. Ma'am, we appreciate your flexibility today. Flexibility. The word lingered in Naomi's mind. It sounded courteous, but it carried an assumption. Someone had already decided that she would be the one expected to sacrifice. Around them, the atmosphere inside first class shifted almost imperceptibly. A retired military officer folded his arms, watching closely. A woman traveling for a medical conference quietly removed her reading glasses. Two business travelers who had been discussing quarterly earnings stopped speaking altogether. The cabin no longer felt like a place preparing for departure. It felt like a room waiting for a verdict. Emily looked down at her tablet once again. The passenger manifest still displayed Naomi Brooks assigned to seat 2 Alpha. She knew what she was seeing. She also knew that contradicting 2 supervisors could jeopardize the career she had worked years to build. Her fingers tightened around the device. Daniel finally extended his hand toward Naomi. May I see your boarding pass? Naomi handed it over without hesitation. He glanced at it for less than 2 seconds before returning it. I understand your frustration, he said. But operational adjustments happen every day. We would appreciate your cooperation. Naomi accepted the boarding pass and carefully placed it back into her bag. Interesting, she replied softly. You looked at the paper. You never looked at the system. Daniel's confident expression flickered for the first time. Before he could respond, the aircraft door remained open, boarding paused, and every person within earshot began realizing this was no longer about a seat. It was becoming a test of whether procedure would follow facts or simply protect the first decision that had already been made. Emily could feel every heartbeat in the silence that followed. Her eyes remained fixed on the passenger manifest glowing softly on her tablet. Seat 2 Alpha, Naomi Brooks. Confirmed. There was no update, no reassignment, no operational change. Just the original assignment she had verified at the gate less than 15 minutes earlier. She looked toward Daniel Reeves, then toward the senior flight attendant, weighing the cost of speaking against the cost of remaining silent. Finally, she took another careful step forward. Sir, she said, addressing Daniel with unmistakable respect, the manifest has not changed. Seat 2 Alpha still belongs to Ms. Brooks. The words landed with far more force than her quiet voice suggested. Daniel glanced briefly toward her tablet, but did not ask to see it. Instead, he answered with practiced composure. Emily, we are handling the situation. But the system, she began. That is enough, the senior attendant interrupted. Emily lowered her eyes, yet she did not step back this time. Across the aisle, the older woman who had been reading earlier slowly closed her newspaper. Young lady, she said gently. Are you saying the passenger standing in the aisle actually has the correct seat? Emily hesitated. Company policy discouraged discussing internal information with passengers. Her silence answered the question anyway. The retired military officer sitting behind her leaned forward. Then why is someone else sitting there? Nobody from the crew responded. The businessman occupying 2 Alpha shifted uncomfortably for the first time. The confidence that had surrounded him since boarding began to crack. Look, he said defensively. I accepted the seat they offered me. I did not ask where it came from. Naomi turned toward him with the same calm expression she had carried since entering the aircraft. I believe you, she replied. This is not about accepting an offer. It is about why the offer existed in the first place. Those words spread quietly through the cabin. They carried no accusation, only a question that everyone suddenly found difficult to ignore. Near row 3, a software engineer reached for his phone, instinctively preparing to record what was unfolding. Naomi noticed the movement immediately. Please, she said with a polite smile. Put it away. He looked surprised. People should see this. Naomi gently shook her head. No. If truth depends on a video, then we have already accepted the wrong standard. Let people hear each other first. The passenger slowly slipped the phone back into his pocket. The older woman nodded with quiet admiration. That takes grace, she whispered. Emily looked at Naomi differently now. Most passengers in similar situations became louder with every passing minute. This woman became calmer. Daniel Reeves folded his arms, attempting to restore control over the increasingly attentive cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We are simply resolving a seating concern. Naomi met his eyes. No, you are deciding whose inconvenience matters more. Daniel remained silent. Outside the aircraft windows, the baggage loaders had finished their work. The jet bridge remained attached, but departure was already running behind schedule. Inside the cabin, however, time seemed to move differently. Every second exposed another layer of what had happened. Emily gathered her courage one final time. Holding the tablet where Daniel could clearly see it, she spoke carefully. I cannot change the system because I do not have that authority, but I can confirm that no reassignment appears in the passenger record. Daniel looked at the screen for the first time since the disagreement began. His expression hardened, not because the information surprised him, but because everyone else had now heard it. The explanation that had seemed convincing only moments earlier was beginning to collapse under the weight of simple facts. And for the first time since Naomi stepped aboard, the cabin stopped treating her like a passenger asking for special treatment and started wondering whether she had simply been asking for the seat that had always been hers. Daniel Reeves drew a slow breath before speaking again, his voice measured but noticeably firmer than before. Ms. Brooks, regardless of what the manifest currently displays, we need to keep this flight on schedule. I am asking you to cooperate while we complete our review after departure. Naomi looked at him steadily. Your review begins by moving the person who holds the valid seat, not the person occupying it. The sentence was quiet, yet every word landed with unmistakable weight. No one interrupted. The businessman shifted uneasily, suddenly finding the leather seat beneath him far less comfortable than it had been moments earlier. He glanced toward Daniel as though expecting reassurance, but none came. Instead, the senior flight attendant reached toward the overhead compartment above seat 2 Alpha and carefully removed Naomi's carry-on suitcase. Without asking permission, she rolled it several feet down the aisle and stopped beside an empty economy tag that had already been printed. Emily's eyes widened. That bag belongs here, she said before catching herself. The senior attendant ignored her completely. Naomi watched her suitcase move away without taking a single step forward. Years ago, that simple act would have felt humiliating. Today it felt familiar. Her mind drifted back 18 years to another airport on another rainy afternoon. She had been 26, flying home after closing the first major investment deal of her career. She had paid for a first-class ticket with nearly every dollar she could spare because, for the first time in her life, she wanted to celebrate something she had earned. A gate agent looked at her boarding pass, looked at her face, then quietly suggested there had probably been a mistake. Minutes later, another passenger had been escorted to her seat while she accepted an apology that explained nothing. She remembered sitting in the back of that airplane staring through the window, wondering whether success would ever be enough to erase assumptions made before she even spoke. She promised herself something during that flight. If she ever reached a position where she could influence the way companies treated people, she would build systems where dignity depended on facts instead of appearances. That promise had followed her through every boardroom, every acquisition, every impossible negotiation. And now, standing only a few feet from the seat she had lawfully reserved, she realized the world had presented her with the same examination once again. The difference was that she was no longer the young entrepreneur wondering whether anyone would listen. She had become someone capable of changing entire industries. Back inside the cabin, the silence felt almost tangible. The older woman finally stood. "Excuse me," she said politely to Daniel. "I have flown this airline for nearly 20 years. I have never seen a passenger lose a confirmed seat without anyone verifying the record." The retired military officer nodded in agreement. "Procedure exists for a reason. Follow it." Several other passengers quietly voiced their support, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the atmosphere inside first class began shifting away from unquestioned authority and toward uncomfortable accountability. Naomi looked at her suitcase resting several rows away before turning back to Daniel. "You moved my belongings before confirming your decision," she said softly. "That tells me the outcome was chosen before the facts were." Daniel opened his mouth, searching for an answer that would satisfy both the passengers and his own crew, but every explanation sounded weaker than the one before it. Emily continued holding the manifest in plain view, the assignment unchanged, the evidence impossible to ignore. Naomi reached calmly into the pocket of her sweater and wrapped her fingers around her phone. She did not unlock it. She did not dial. She simply held it for a moment, as though deciding whether this situation still belonged to the cabin crew or whether it had reached the point where someone far beyond this aircraft needed to know exactly what had just happened. Naomi looked at the phone in her hand for several quiet seconds before unlocking it with a single touch. There was no frustration on her face, no dramatic gesture, no attempt to win the room. She simply selected one contact from the top of her recent calls and placed the phone against her ear. The line connected almost immediately. "Sophia," she said calmly. "Good afternoon." The woman on the other end answered without hesitation. "Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks. We are ready whenever you are." Naomi glanced once toward her suitcase sitting several rows away, then toward the passengers who had slowly become witnesses instead of bystanders. "Please activate Meridian Protocol. Pause all documentation related to the $940 million partnership until further notice." Silence followed for only a fraction of a second before Sophia responded with the same composed professionalism. "Understood. I am notifying legal, finance, and executive strategy now. Should I inform the board that implementation is suspended pending your review?" "Yes," Naomi replied. "Also request that Horizon Air executive leadership join the conference line immediately. I believe they should understand why the process has stopped." "Already in motion," Sophia answered. "Estimated response time is under 5 minutes." Naomi ended the call as quietly as she had begun it and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She did not explain what Meridian Protocol meant. She did not mention contracts, investment committees, or ownership percentages. She simply waited. Daniel Reeves watched her carefully, searching for some indication that the conversation had been a bluff. The senior flight attendant gave a dismissive smile. "People make impressive phone calls all the time," she said softly enough for only Daniel to hear. "We still have a schedule to keep." Daniel nodded, but the certainty that had guided him only minutes earlier was beginning to disappear. Emily remained standing with the passenger manifest still open in front of her. She noticed Daniel looking toward Naomi's phone more often now than toward the boarding records. Across the aisle, the retired military officer leaned back in his seat and quietly folded his hands. "That was not the call of someone trying to win an argument," he murmured. The older woman beside him nodded. "No, that sounded like someone making a business decision." Even the businessman occupying seat 2 Alpha no longer appeared comfortable. He loosened his seat belt before realizing the aircraft had not even left the gate. His eyes drifted repeatedly toward Naomi, trying to place where he might have seen her before. There was something familiar about her confidence, something that belonged less to airports and more to boardrooms. Outside the windows, the baggage vehicles had cleared away, but the aircraft remained motionless. Inside the cabin, flight attendants exchanged unusually quiet conversations near the galley entrance. The normal rhythm of departure had slowed almost to a stop. Naomi stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, never raising her voice, never asking anyone to apologize. She simply allowed the consequences of each decision to continue unfolding at their own pace. Emily finally looked directly at Naomi. "May I ask you something?" Naomi smiled gently. "Of course." Emily hesitated before speaking. "When all of this started, you never sounded surprised." Naomi's expression softened for just a moment. "Because this is not the first time I have watched people make a decision before they looked at the facts." Emily lowered her eyes. The sentence stayed with her longer than any accusation could have. A few seconds later, Daniel's company phone vibrated once in his jacket pocket. Then it vibrated again. Before he could answer either call, the senior flight attendant's phone lit up with an incoming call from airline operations. Almost simultaneously, another device belonging to the gate supervisor outside the aircraft began ringing through the open cabin door. 3 phones, 3 different departments, all at the same time. And for the first time since Naomi boarded the aircraft, the crew members who had controlled every conversation suddenly realized that someone else might now be directing events far beyond the cabin they believed they controlled. Daniel reached for his phone almost instinctively. The display read Executive Operations. Before he could answer, the call ended. A second later it rang again. This time the caller identification displayed Corporate Executive Office. His expression changed. Senior cabin crew rarely received direct calls from that department. He answered immediately, his professional tone returning. Daniel Reeves speaking. He listened for several seconds without saying a word. The color slowly drained from his face. "Yes, sir," he finally replied. "She is still on board." Across the aisle, The senior flight attendant's own phone continued vibrating. She answered with visible confidence, expecting routine instructions. Instead, her posture stiffened almost instantly. I understand, she whispered before looking toward Naomi with eyes that no longer carried certainty. Outside the aircraft, the gate supervisor hurried back onto the jet bridge while speaking urgently into a headset. Another airport operations manager appeared behind him, walking much faster than anyone normally did before departure. Inside the cabin, passengers watched the quiet chain reaction unfold without anyone needing an explanation. Naomi remained exactly where she had been all along, hands folded loosely in front of her, her expression unchanged. The businessman sitting in seat 2 Alpha cleared his throat. What exactly is happening? No one answered him. Emily looked toward Daniel, waiting for instructions that never came. Instead, Daniel slowly lowered his phone. He looked at Naomi with an expression that had completely replaced authority with uncertainty. Ms. Brooks, he began carefully, may I ask, are you connected to Meridian Capital? Naomi met his eyes. I am. The cabin fell even quieter. Daniel swallowed. In what capacity? Naomi did not hesitate. I am its chief executive officer. No one spoke. Even the usual sounds of passengers organizing bags and adjusting seats seemed to disappear beneath the weight of those words. The businessman blinked several times before looking down at the armrest beneath him, suddenly aware that he was occupying someone else's assigned seat. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Everything made sense now. The calm, the confidence, the single phone call. Daniel's phone rang again. He answered immediately. Yes, sir. Another pause followed. Understood. He slowly lowered the device before turning toward the senior flight attendant. Executive leadership has confirmed Ms. Brooks' identity. Nobody moved. Daniel continued quietly, almost as though speaking louder would make the moment worse. The strategic partnership scheduled for tomorrow has been placed on hold. The businessman looked toward Naomi. That was because of this. Naomi answered without anger. No, it was because decisions were made without facts. Her voice remained steady. You gave away a confirmed seat before verifying the record. Then you defended the decision instead of correcting it. Every sentence landed with the precision of someone accustomed to explaining difficult truths inside boardrooms rather than arguments. Daniel lowered his eyes. The senior flight attendant looked as though she wanted to say something, but no words came. Emily still held the tablet displaying the unchanged assignment for seat 2 Alpha. It had never changed. It had never been reassigned. The evidence had been there from the beginning. Naomi finally looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of passengers who had quietly witnessed everything unfold. You believed I did not belong before anyone checked whether I did, she said softly. The boarding pass was never the problem. The silence that followed seemed to settle over every row of the aircraft. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody whispered. Even the businessman who had accepted the seat looked down with visible regret. Somewhere beyond the open aircraft door, hurried footsteps echoed across the jet bridge as multiple executives approached the cabin, while inside, every person present understood that the conversation had already shifted from a disagreement over seating to a lesson about judgment, dignity, and the cost of making assumptions before looking at the truth. The aircraft door remained open as 3 senior executives from Horizon Air walked briskly down the jet bridge, their expressions carrying none of the calm confidence normally seen before departure. At their front was Executive Vice President Michael Donovan, still holding his phone as though the conversation had not truly ended. The moment he stepped into the first-class cabin, his eyes found Naomi immediately. Without hesitation, he walked directly toward her. Ms. Brooks, he said respectfully, thank you for waiting. The change in tone was impossible to miss. Only minutes earlier the cabin crew had spoken to her, as though she were delaying the flight. Now one of the airline's highest-ranking executives was standing in the aisle addressing her with unmistakable deference. Daniel Reeves quietly stepped aside. The senior flight attendant lowered her eyes. Emily remained near the galley, still holding the tablet that had contained the truth from the very beginning. Michael looked toward the businessman occupying seat 2 Alpha. Sir, I sincerely apologize. That seat was never available for reassignment. The man stood immediately. I understand, he replied quietly. I should have asked more questions. He collected his briefcase without complaint and stepped into the aisle. There was no argument. only the uncomfortable realization that convenience had been built upon someone else's rights. Michael personally gestured toward Naomi's original seat. Before she moved, however, Naomi looked toward her suitcase still resting several rows away. Emily was already walking toward it. She retrieved the carry-on herself and returned it with both hands. "I am sorry," she said sincerely. Naomi accepted the bag with a gentle smile. "Thank you for following the facts when it mattered." Emily nodded, visibly emotional but composed. Michael then turned toward Daniel and the senior flight attendant. "Corporate operations has instructed that this incident be documented in full," he said evenly. "Every communication, every passenger record, every decision made from boarding until this moment will be reviewed by the Ethics and Customer Experience Committee." No threats, no raised voices. Simply a process that suddenly felt very real. Daniel accepted the instruction with a quiet nod. "Understood." The senior flight attendant remained silent, her earlier confidence completely gone. Michael continued, speaking carefully enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Our partnership discussions with Meridian Capital have been paused pending Ms. Brooks' assessment of today's events. That decision affects projects far beyond this flight." The words settled heavily across the cabin. Several passengers exchanged astonished looks. A medical researcher quietly whispered, "One decision changed everything." The retired military officer answered just as softly, "No, a series of decisions did." Naomi finally placed her carry-on into the overhead compartment above seat 2 Alpha herself. She did not rush. She did not make anyone wait longer than necessary. Every movement reflected the same quiet discipline she had shown from the beginning. Once seated, she fastened her seat belt without ceremony. Michael remained standing beside her. "Ms. Brooks, on behalf of Horizon Air, I offer my sincere apology. We failed to uphold the standards we promise every passenger." Naomi looked toward him with calm eyes. "Standards are not measured by mission statements," she replied. "They are measured by what employees choose to do before anyone important is watching." Michael slowly nodded. He knew there was nothing to argue with. Around the cabin, passengers who had remained silent witnesses throughout the entire experience now understood why Naomi had never shouted, never demanded special treatment, and never attempted to embarrass anyone publicly. She had simply allowed every choice to reveal itself. Outside, the final baggage cart pulled away from the aircraft. Inside, first class felt strangely different. The tension had disappeared, replaced by thoughtful silence. The lesson had arrived before the airplane ever left the gate, and every person on board knew they had witnessed far more than a disagreement over a seat. They had watched accountability arrive quietly, one fact at a time. The cabin doors finally closed with a quiet mechanical sound that felt different now, not because the aircraft had changed, but because the people inside it had. The engine slowly came alive beneath the wings while sunlight reflected across the runway outside. Yet inside first class, no one seemed interested in departure anymore. Passengers who had boarded expecting an ordinary afternoon flight now carried something else entirely. They had witnessed how quickly assumptions could become decisions and how quietly those decisions could unravel when confronted with simple truth. Naomi Brooks sat by the window exactly where she had been assigned from the beginning. She looked out across the airport as aircraft lifted into the afternoon sky one after another. For a brief moment, she remembered that young woman nearly 2 decades earlier sitting alone in the back of another airplane after surrendering a seat she had rightfully purchased because she believed there was nothing else she could do. She smiled gently to herself. That young woman had not disappeared. She had simply grown into someone who could make certain fewer people would have to experience the same quiet humiliation. Emily walked down the aisle one final time before taking her assigned jump seat. As she reached Naomi's row, she paused for just a second. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Naomi looked up. "For what?" Emily answered honestly. "For reminding me that doing the right thing sometimes begins with speaking even when your voice shakes." Naomi nodded warmly. "And for remembering that facts deserve a chance before assumptions do." Emily smiled before returning to her position. Across the aisle, the older woman unfolded her newspaper again but never turned a page. Instead, she quietly said, "I hope they teach this story in every employee training class." The retired military officer beside her gave a small smile. "Not because of the apology," he replied. because of what happened before anyone realized who she was. Even the businessman who had accepted seat 2 Alpha earlier leaned slightly across the aisle. Before speaking, "Ms. Brooks," he said, "I owe you an apology as well. I accepted something that was never mine because it benefited me. I should have questioned it." Naomi met his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the day. "The important question is whether you will remember it the next time someone else is treated that way." He nodded quietly. "I will." The aircraft began rolling toward the runway as cabin announcements resumed their familiar rhythm. Everything sounded ordinary again, yet every person on board knew this flight would remain with them long after they reached Seattle. Michael Donovan looked once more toward Naomi before returning to the cockpit to coordinate the delayed departure. The incident report would continue through corporate channels. Policies would be reviewed. Procedures would change. Meetings would be scheduled. Those things mattered. But Naomi believed the most important change had already happened inside the cabin. People who had remained silent at the beginning had found the courage to question what they were seeing before it became too late. As the airplane accelerated down the runway, Naomi rested one hand lightly on the armrest and watched the city slowly disappear beneath the clouds. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded privilege. She had only insisted that the same rules apply to everyone. Before closing her eyes for the short flight, she quietly spoke words that only the nearest passengers could hear. Respect is never proven after someone learns your title. It is proven in the moment they believe you have none. No one answered because no answer was necessary. The engines carried the aircraft higher into the sky, while the lesson remained behind in every heart that had witnessed it. Some passengers would remember the delayed departure. Others would remember the executive walking onto the airplane. But those who truly understood what had happened would remember something much simpler. Character is revealed long before identity is confirmed, and dignity should never depend on who someone turns out to be.